Hi, I'm Jane Hutcheon, and in July 2010 I created 1+1, and up until September 2019 recorded nearly 500 interviews. In this series, I'm bringing together my top 10. They're the conversations which have taken me by surprise or somehow had an impact on me. I hope you enjoyed this interview with journalist Peter Harvey. Peter Harvey, welcome to 1+1.
Jane, thank you very much.
You got your first job on the Daily Telegraph as a copy boy, I believe, when Frank Packer was in charge. First jobs are often daunting. Did Sir Frank Packer live up to his reputation?
Oh, to every inch of his giant boots. He was an amazing man. The stories about Sir Frank are legend, and the stories that we know are true, I think, are topped by one of them. He had a private elevator to the Telegraph building and was trying to get in one morning, and he could see the indicator, the needle going up and down, up and down. Eventually it came down, and there's a young boy there with a satchel over his shoulder, and Sir Frank said to him, "How much do you earn, son?" And the kid said, "Oh, £5, 7 and 6pence, mate." And Sir Frank pulled out £50 and said, "Get it, piss off, never want to see you again, you're in my lift." He was a post office telegram boy.
So did you find him daunting personally?
Oh, he could be. He could be terrifying, this huge figure. It was not unknown for Sir Frank to come back from the races on a Sunday where the Telegraph staff, the Daily staff also worked for the Sunday, and sack us all. If he'd had a bad day, just walk into the newsroom and say, "You're all blood-sucking leeches, get out of here." And we'd all go down to the pub next door, as one did in those days, and wait for David McNichol or one of the editors to come down and tell us to come up. And that's one of the reasons why the Sunday Telegraph was invariably late out every third or fourth Saturday, whenever he lost. But he was a fearsome character.
So what made you take a job with the Daily Telegraph?
There was a luxury of choice for me in those days. My family, long history of newspaper people, were working for the Sydney Sun and the Sydney Morning Herald, and which left the Mirror and the Daily Telegraph. The Australian hadn't come along as yet, although it was about to. And I thought, if I can crack a job at the Telegraph, no one ever can ever accuse me of riding in on my uncle's coattails. So I rocked up to the telly and said, "I want to be a copy boy, please." And they said, "Oh, son, you're going to have to prove your mettle here. This is a tough place," and went through the usual jargon.
So how did you prove your mettle?
Well, you just get on with the job. It's then is exactly like now. It's a job that both you and I have to do, and you have to do it as well and as professionally as possible, and you just do it. Harder then because you're learning all the ropes. Or maybe it's easier because you don't know where the ropes are, and you just crash over them as you get through. But you just do your job.
You got a Walkley Award when you were 19 years old.
I did, yes.
How did you get it?
It was a product of time and circumstance. In those days, you could get stories in the paper up until 3 a.m. I was sent in the police rounds car out to Maroubra or Matraville or somewhere where there'd been a gangland shooting. I dictated the story back over the two-way radio. Photographer got his pictures back, and I picked up a Walkley for excellent news coverage. Breaking story, excellent news coverage.
Did it mean something to you at the time?
God, everything.
It must have made your
Just
career.
Everything. It helped. It certainly did. But it gets back to the point that I've just made. It's only one part of that career. Then you've just got to notch it up a little and keep on going.
You headed off to the UK in the mid-60s. You worked for The Guardian and Newsweek. Was there a push factor? Did you want to leave Australia particularly, or was there a pull factor?
Well, it worked the other way round. I used to read Newsweek in the Telegraph office each week, and one particular, and it never mentioned Australia, ever, until one week there was a story about Sydney, which was spelled Sidney. And being a very cheeky person, I wrote a letter to the chief of correspondence at Newsweek, a guy called Hal Bruno, and said, "Do you guys need some help with a stringer in Sydney?" And they wrote back and said, "Yeah, be our stringer." And so I started stringing for them, and then they came out here and set up an Australian edition, and I worked for them here while that got off the ground. Then they sent me to Vietnam for a while, and then came back to Sydney, and they, at that stage, had made all the money they were going to make out of the Australian operation, so they decided to basically close it down and said to me, what do you want to do? Do you want to come and live in America and work in America? But Anne and I had always wanted to go and live in London, so this was the opportunity. And sometime later, after saving money by working for 2UE and 2GB and learning a bit of radio, we jumped on a boat, and because that's what you did then, and went to London, and after, I guess, about a month of scratching around Fleet Street, working, and this is where the radio paid off, because I got a job with BBC Radio London and then did a bit of part-time work for the Express. And then the Guardian rang me one day and said, we've seen your resume, when can you start? Lucky.
So you covered Vietnam. How did that leave its mark on you and your work as a journalist?
It taught me to be very careful about all sorts of things. I mean, the first thing I did in those heady days arriving in Saigon was to go down to what was called Change Alley, where you could buy absolutely everything. And I saw all the famous American television correspondents walking around in their combat suits. And so I had to go and buy one of these things. And then I went and bought a gun. I know. Fortunately, before I did anything else, I went back to the Newsweek bureau, and they all just recoiled in horror. And they said, you're asking to be shot dead. You know, what's the matter with you? They said, what you do is you get rid of all that stuff you're wearing. You go back to your hotel, you buy the biggest, loudest Hawaiian shirt you can find. You make sure you never, ever wear anything that looks like a gun belt, and you look like a tourist. It was great advice, because so many people who did play the correspondent game didn't come out of it too well.
It's often said it was the first war that really landed in the living rooms of ordinary people. Did you have a sense of that at the time?
Not so much, because Newsweek was the epitome of group journalism. I mean, there'd be, say, I think there were 10 of us working out of the Saigon Bureau. My job was to be with the Marines up on the DMZ and the border, and I'd file a copy about what was going on with the Marines that week, what operations they were on, what patrols they'd been on, and so forth. And other people scattered around Vietnam would also file similar stories. Now, all of that was welded together in New York by the writers and the editors. But to answer your question, there was no doubt that the impact of television on the American, in particular the American audience, was extraordinary. This is so long ago, we're talking pre-satellite. It took about 2 days for the
film, wasn't it?
To get to a transmission point, usually in Hawaii or California, and then go on air. But there was no doubt from the reaction that you were seeing that people were just shocked, stunned, appalled, horrified, the full range of emotion. And the same thing, of course, then at a later date began to happen in Australia. Once our diggers came up there and the disgraceful business of the conscripts, killing these 19-year-old kids. I mean, that song of Red Gums is absolutely correct.
I was only 19, is that the...
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you also went on to cover Gulf War I and II. It's a pretty different world from when you were a TV journalist covering war with satellite and all the technology that we had then, let alone now. Does war touch people in different ways? Are we perhaps completely blasé about conflict when we see it on the screen now?
I think much of what you've just said is absolutely true. The people who are touched are the people who lose their loved ones, the people whose sons and now daughters are killed in combat. For the rest of us, I tend to think sometimes we simply get swamped by this enormous tsunami of news and pictures and emotion that comes rolling in from whatever the latest battlefield is. But I tend to think people are become inured, is probably the best way of describing it, to the tragedy.
When you got into television, you came back to Australia after spending time overseas. It was the mid-70s. You joined the Nine network. What was it about television reporting that attracted you?
It was a friendship more than anything else, with which I'd struck up with Gerald Stone, who was news director of the Nine network at the time, and a wonderful old character called Alan Reid, who was probably one of the two finest news gatherers I've ever seen operating in Australia. And he worked for the Telegraph, which owned Channel 9, and they both approached me and said they needed somebody to run the Canberra Bureau. They were starting up a full-time Canberra Bureau, and would I be interested? And I said yes. It was something new, it was something different, it was a challenge. Yeah.
And knowing what you know about politics now, what do you think has changed in the realm of Australian politics over the decades?
Well, I think the emergence of the Hawke and Keating Labor government is highly significant. Keating, I suspect, will be judged very kindly by history as a reforming treasurer for all the things that the man did. There's just no doubt about that.
And do you think he should be?
I do, yes. Oh, yes. No, I'm a big fan of Paul Keating's. And Hawke, too. Hawke had that breakthrough touch. I mean, Whitlam had a lovely anecdote about his achievements, and he quite often would say that, comrade, when I came to office, the western suburbs of every city in Australia wasn't sewered. I have left them fully flushed. And he had. It's hard to believe that the vast majority of the outer suburbs in every Australian city were unsewered. Now, what more fundamental need is there than that? And whether Malcolm continued that process or not, I'm not too sure. He was a very interesting man, Malcolm. You know, he used to go each year to Robben Island and see Nelson Mandela, just quietly go over there and give him support. And he was very concerned about the Indigenous Australian problem. But it's hard to see any point in his regime, and he'll, I'm sure, have a go at me about this, where he's used that colossal political muscle to say, fix this. Right. Hawke comes along, Keating comes along, and they do. Superannuation, floating the dollar, all the financial changes, school education, all changes that we still live with were pioneered or seen through by Hawke and Paul Keating. And as I say, I think they'll be judged very well.
What do you make of our current crop of leaders? You talk about reform and change. Julia Gillard, the first female Prime Minister, she's obviously introduced a lot of school reforms. She's an agnostic. She's pretty different. She's coming up against Tony Abbott, a devout Catholic. Do you see either of them? Will they go down in history too?
The job maketh the person. So we have to put Abbott aside, I think, for the moment and see how and when he performs as Prime Minister. But I think if Julia Gillard, her two deepest regrets must be the aborted promise over carbon tax. And I would submit that she probably has nightmares too about the way in which Rudd was rolled. If there could have been, if it's possible in politics to have a nicer and gentler ways of doing that, it would have been much more encouraging to everybody out there to look at her and say, okay, well, she's trying to do the right thing. As it is, people have got a bad taste in their mouth, and she's trying to overcome that.
Just want to go to something a little bit light-hearted before I turn a corner. People, when they hear of you, would often say, oh, Peter Harvey, Canberra, as I'm sure you know.
I still do, yeah. One of the funny things, I'm getting kids aged 18 and 19 coming up to me and say, would you say Peter Harvey, Canberra for me? You know, I left Canberra in 97.
But in terms of that sort of persona that you have, a lot of people, a lot of journalists, for example, struggle with that sign-off because it's sort of an unnatural thing to do. When you first started that sign-off, it's very iconic, if you like. Did you put much thought into it?
Almost none at all. I was simply directed by my news director, who at this stage was a guy called Ian Cook, to sign off at the end of each story and say where you are, because that's what we did in those days. And then Mike Carlton, who was a very good friend, jumped onto the bandwagon with Friday News Review and rubbery figures, and all of a sudden I was out there being poked and pilloried from one side of the continent to the other. But if you look like I do and sound like I do, Jane, you just cop it.
Peter, I want to turn to your cancer diagnosis that you got late last year. You were on holiday at the time, I believe.
Anne and I had taken what was to be the holiday of a lifetime.
So you've been married 45 years.
45 years, yes. I've got 2 children. Adam Harvey, who works here with 7:30. He's married to Eliza Harvey, who works for the News, who's Geraldine Doog's daughter, and my daughter Claire is deputy editor of the Sunday Telegraph. Now, at no stage did I chase them into this business. They found their feet in the press gallery in Canberra and have gone on to do pretty well. But the relationship with Anne has always been very strong, very deep. And we decided that come the 45th, we'd go off on a decent trip. So we went to Dubai, first of all, just to see that amazing building, you know, saying, but God, look at that, you know. And then on to London for a while, and then down to Florence and Venice. And it was in Venice that I'd been feeling sort of more as though it was indigestion more than anything else. Woke up one morning and Anne was looking at me and she said, "You've gone the colour of a post-it pad," which was the jaundice. And so this was the really good part. The hotel doctor said, "We better get you to hospital straight away and get a few tests done." So downstairs, into the motorboat lobby, into the back of the motorboat, through the canals of Venice, off to the hospital. They diagnosed jaundice and said, you know, you can stay here for 2 weeks or go home. And so with that, there was another motorboat ride all the way back to the hotel, and we called our travel agent and went home. And I was in hospital about 2 days after I got back, and they diagnosed the pancreatic cancer, and which was at a fairly extreme level, but no one, least of all me, is giving up hope.
How did you respond when you heard that diagnosis? Did you have a feeling that you were seriously ill?
I did, yeah, at that stage. I thought, judging by the looks on the faces of the oncologists and the gastroenterologists and the people in Rome, there's obviously something wrong, and there was. And it was a tiny cancer on the pancreas. So then you say to yourself, what do I do now? And you can go one of 2 ways, I guess. The cancer nurses say that an awful lot of people at that stage give up and say, I've got this thing, I'll let them give me whatever treatment that they've got, but they become more pessimistic about it. But they say the ones who survive invariably are the people who hang on to the anchor points in their lives, their jobs, their families, and who make an effort. So it's in my nature to have the glass half full, not half empty. And so from October to now, that's what I've been doing. A lot of half-full glasses. And we seem to be getting there, please God.
The writer Christopher Hitchens, in his final book, which was called Mortality, talked about the depression he faced in the first 7 days after his diagnosis for esophageal cancer, particularly when he was told that certain therapies were not open to him. And he spoke about a sense of being cheated as well as disappointed. Can you understand that? Did you ever get those sentiments?
Yes,
in the early days?
I don't want to be cheated. I'm 68 years old. I consider I've got a fair bit of living that I want to do. As soon as we're able to, Anne and I are going back to Florence and Venice to finish this thing off. It was, I guess, an understandable reaction. Like, you think to yourself, oh, why me? Why is this happening? But you get past that point and you say, okay, well, it is happening. So let's deal with it and let's be as positive as possible about it and get the show back on the road. Now, a lot of cliches there, but they're meaningful. If you hang on to the possibility that things are going to be better, not worse, I think it sets you up pretty well. I don't want worries about my day ruining my tomorrows, basically.
You said that you wanted to continue the holiday in Venice as soon as you're able. What kind of a regiment are you on at the moment in terms of your treatment?
I'm deeply into chemotherapy. I take a number of tablets during the course of a day to ease pain. But I think most cancer patients or chemo patients would appreciate this. I haven't been ill. I remember right at the very beginning, the nurses said to me, "You realise you may lose all your hair." And I said, "I don't really care about the hair. Don't want to be seasick for 3 months." And they said, "We can do things now that can prevent all of that," and they can.
So you have chemotherapy once a week, is it?
Every Friday.
How does that knock you about?
It's the main effect of the chemo with me, and I gather with an awful lot of people, is this sense of lethargy. It's difficult to get a lot of energy for climbing stairs. You can still do it, but you've just got to push through it.
And do you want to continue working?
Oh, absolutely. 60 Minutes is coming back shortly, and we're devising a new programming format for that. I want to keep doing the stuff I do for the Today. Short answer, yes. I want to keep working as long as I possibly can, which I hope is for a very long time.
You had a pretty overwhelming response when you were presenting the mailbag on 60 Minutes after you had first spoken about your cancer diagnosis. How did that feel?
It made me feel very grateful. Jane, I have been absolutely overwhelmed by the support and the reaction from people around this country. It's been extraordinary. People are sympathetic and they're kind and they're considerate, and they write letters in enormous volumes, and I mean, the answer is I felt extraordinarily grateful that so many people out there went out of their way to wish me good luck.
You've said that the diagnosis was serious. I presume that means your condition is terminal.
Yes, if it keeps on like this, yes.
What is the best you can hope for, do you think?
The oncologists say that the very best I can hope for at this stage is for the cancer to be controlled, to not increase in size. The very best I can hope for at this stage is for the cancer to actually decrease in size. And beyond that, we're not looking at anything else. But yeah, I may have this right, but I think it was a grade 4 cancer.
And apparently there's no grade 5, is that right?
I believe so.
Again, Christopher Hitchens describes when people are talking to him, and he would often answer if they said, "How are you today?" He would say things like, "I seem to have cancer." Does it bother you when people want to talk about your cancer, or are you a natural sharer?
I think I'm a natural sharer. It doesn't bother me that people want to come up and talk to me about it. It does me good, to be honest with you. This conversation's doing me good.
How so?
It's making me realise that the alternative to what I'm going through now is not necessarily death. That the alternative to what I'm going through now could well be an extension of life. I mean, what they say to me, the specialists, is that we're pretty sure we can guarantee to maintain the quality of your life for, and that's the series of question marks. How long is the for? Talking about it is better than not talking about it. Reminds me of what a lot of the diggers used to say after Vietnam. The worst piece of advice they were ever given was don't talk about it. Shut it up inside you, all the terrible things that happen to you, all the fears that you've got, all the worries that you've got. Don't talk about it. You mustn't bother other people with it. Well, I find most other people broach the subject. And if they're serious, well, sit and talk.
You're a spiritual person, aren't you? And you're a religious, devout Anglican, is that right?
Yes, I guess. I wouldn't put a label on it. I believe very strongly in the existence of God and Jesus Christ. I went to a Church of England boarding school for some years, and that knocked any love of formalised religion out of me, I'm here to tell you. The lack of love that you got as a young child from the Anglican teachers at a certain school in Australia not very pleasant, and it turned me right off. But what has reinforced me down the years is this belief in the existence of a God and in his Son, Jesus Christ. I believe very strongly.
Do you fear death?
No, not anymore.
Did you used to fear death?
I think before I started to go through this process, back in October, I would have, God, what's it going to be like? What in heaven's name happens to you? All the things that run through people's minds, will I be in agony as I die and so forth. Then you realise that you've got no control over it anyway, that if you're going to die, and we all are, you're going to die. And the prospect of, it comes back to something I said earlier, I'm not going to let fears and worries about tomorrow ruin my today. I'm not. Just take the most out of each day for as long as I possibly can.
I'm going to end with a glass half full question. You've surfed many waves with Channel 9. Some would say it's not a good time for commercial television news at the moment, with a lot of belt tightening going on. What's your outlook for TV journalism?
I think the future of television journalism, of television news, is strong and solid. I think what Nine's doing with its development of news and the other programs is good. The ABC, of course, is a case in point with News 24 and programs like yours. There's no diminution of this. There's more, which I think is terrific. The more we're informed, the better we are.
Peter Harvey, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for speaking with 1+1.
Jane, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
And that's one of my top 10. Thanks for watching. You can watch again on iView. See you next time.